So I think we're going to start. Welcome the few and the proud who have found us at 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. We're hoping others have promised to join us, and we'll find the location, not marked, by the way, E2. So welcome to Union Session 11, Mitigating Flood Risk and Climate Change Impacts Through Managed Retreat. The focus of this morning's session is managed retreat. That is a relatively new field of research and related public policy. It's new and timely. Sea level rise, extreme weather, and flooding along the world's rivers and coastlines threaten communities, particularly small towns that cannot afford large protective infrastructure. Looking forward towards a climate-changed future, some of these towns will inevitably need to relocate permanently. So this is, again, a new field of research, and as such, some of the terminology hasn't yet settled down and is used in different ways. So I recommend to everyone, if you're interested in this, take a look at, this is the BBC definition, and it places managed retreat at the end of a spectrum that ranges from hard engineering solutions, for example, to flood protection on coastlines, down to non-structural solutions. And this framework works equally well for coastal processes and for floodplain management as well. So managed retreat has been in the headlines in the last couple of years. In particular, among his last acts in office, former President Obama instructed 11 federal agencies to establish a framework for managed retreat. In this context in particular, this refers to wholesale relocation of communities threatened by sea level rise and coastal flooding. That focus on community relocation is, I should mention, the focus of some of the research in my lab in particular. And so I'll talk just a little bit as people drift into the room about that later in the talk. In this context, I think it's important to mention that the opposite of managed retreat is not necessarily engineering, but it's no action whatsoever. It is after a flood to rebuild in place, which is unfortunately the major strategy for flood recovery in the U.S. So FEMA counts over 30,000 properties that have been severely flooded at least 4 times, and each time rebuilt in place at taxpayer expense. The alternative, or one alternative to that, is community relocation. So some of you may be familiar with Valmeyer, Illinois. This is a town at the time of just about 1,000 people that was catastrophically flooded by the Great Midwestern Flood of 1993. And rebuilt almost entirely, almost its entire population moved up onto the bluff tops, about 300 feet higher in elevation, out of harm's way. In fact, this is one of about a dozen wholesale community relocations that have taken place across the U.S., have been completed or now being implemented or in advanced stages of planning. So what we've learned from this so far is that there's a number of advantages to moving communities, towns in their entirety. In particular, I'd like to point out that this avoids the the piecemeal erosion of communities and can maintain the social fabric intact. On the other side of this scale, what we've learned is that there are challenges to this kind of project. I think some of our speakers today will talk to that. And to be honest, and just in brief summary, many challenges and big ones. So plenty of opportunity to talk afterwards what some of those have been. Again, just to go through the history just very briefly as an introduction to this session. So again, Valmeyer is the poster child of community relocations, in part because the advocates, the architects of this move are very good marketers. Dennis Knobloch was supposed to be here, couldn't make it. As part of the formula for success for that particular relocation. So although the most famous of these relocations, it was not the only one, not even in 1993. So much less well-known, Rhineland, Missouri was also moved. In fact, this was a more complete relocation. At present, there is not a single inhabited structure down in the floodplain within the original town boundary. A much more complete move even than in Valmeyer, where a few people still live down at the old town site. And I attribute that to the good Germanic roots of this town, nice community spirit involved, and they pulled all together. Also in 1993, few of you maybe have heard of Pattonsburg, Missouri. It was moved in its entirety finally after being flooded 33 different times within the town's history. And an interesting historical note to Pattonsburg, the town literally went out in a blaze of glory. It leased itself out to serve as the set for the filming of Ang Lee's movie Ride with the Devil, Civil War era action and drama film. Just to mention a couple of others, there were two very widely publicized community relocations after the 1937 flooding on the Ohio River. And I just wanted to mention Leavenworth, Indiana in particular. This was moved, almost the entire population of the town moved up onto the bluff tops just above the town. And this relocation, the construction was done by the American Red Cross, and that has not been done before or since then. And interestingly, we went back to various generations of maps and imagery there, and what you can see in the lower right-hand side is, because they had not yet learned to deed that original property as permanent open space, much of the original town site now has been reconstructed down on the floodplain in subsequent decades. So we think that the full set of these wholesale relocations provide important lessons for future climate adaptation. Our group conducted hundreds of hours of interviews, a regional survey. We analyzed the hydrology, topography, and other characteristics of each site and completed a geostatistical model of relocation opportunities, which is illustrated pretty poorly right here. This is it's a logistical regression model implemented in the GIS, and this we use to identify what factors community leaders in each of these locations use to select the site of their new town. And we plan to develop this tool as a software app to help communities considering managed relocations now and in the future. So where might such relocations occur? Well, some of our speakers are going to talk about the Louisiana Delta. And in particular, I suspect that Ile de Jean-Charles will come up, one of the winners of last year's National Disaster Resiliency Competition, and an area of active discussion and planning today, and we'll hear more about that. I think we're not going to hear a lot about this, but this has been a lot in the news. It's about a dozen Native American villages north of the Arctic Circle that are actively pursuing relocation at the present time. So in summary and very briefly, and then I'll pass the podium off to Chris. First of all, I'd like to suggest that wholesale community relocation, it's important to note that this will never be a universal solution to climate change and flood risk everywhere. That large cities simply can't be moved. You're not going to get Houston out of the path of future flooding. However, managed retreat relocations can be a viable, cost-effective, and a culturally sensitive solution for some rural communities that suffer from repeated coastal and river flooding. I hope you all enjoy the session. I hope more come and join us for it. A few introductory remarks from my co-convener, Chris Dalbaum from Tulane University.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak for a minute about why it was we pulled this together, why we made all these people come from near and far. Managed retreat is, I think as Nicholas just got across, something that's really difficult and something that isn't actually necessarily the answer everywhere. So we wanted to hear from people from various communities that either have experienced managed retreat or have maybe it's been unmanaged retreat, or people that are trying to figure out how to manage in place. And all of these sorts of different options for communities that are either coastal communities that are facing either a decaying shoreline or sea level rise, or riparian communities, riverine communities that have that option to just kind of jump up off of the floodplain. But I think it's a wide variety of experiences that have taken place and are going to continue to take place. I think Nicholas, I think probably the most important thing from my perspective, that being like a water law and policy attorney, is the default is nothing. The default is just to keep doing what you're doing and have people just kind of bleed away until isn't any community left. And that's, if we do value community the way we say we do, then that easiest option is probably also the worst option. And so these sorts of efforts of trying to figure out how to adapt in place or how to manage a retreat are important discussions that have to take place. And they I think experience shows that the conversations really have to start within the communities. So why are we talking about that here at AGU? Because I think these are efforts that people here at, attending AGU can help with. I think the expertise and the scientific rigor that you can bring to these efforts, to adaptation, to management, to retreat, are really important. And so I'm hoping that we can spur some ideas within the geophysical community as well as how to be useful in these processes. So I think that's probably about time. It's probably 8:50. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started, and you guys can hear from the people that you're here to hear from. Thank you.
Paul, I think you're up here. I think so, yeah. I thought I was going second. Okay, no, so we just introduced instead. Okay. And tell me, Paul, this is you? It's you. There we go. Without further ado, Paul Osman.
Thank you, Nicholas. So I have 13 minutes and 30 slides, or else Nicholas is going to shoot me with his AGU tranquilizer gun if I don't get out of here quick enough. So whenever I speak outside of Illinois, I have to justify myself a bit. When people think of Illinois, it's combines and corn. Anybody who's not from Illinois, this is their image of Illinois right here. We're actually known for other stuff. We have the most jailed governors. 5 of our last governors are in prison right now. We have the most indicted state officials. We're first in poor fiscal policy. We're the most broke state in the nation. We have the most underfunded pension program and the most murders of anywhere in the nation. So if we had, I think you can say this at a scientific conference. I think suck is okay to say, right? It's a technical term, yeah. If we had a T-shirt that summed up Illinois, it would kind of say this, except the back of that T-shirt would say, except floodplain management. That's the one thing that we're really good at in Illinois, the only thing that we're really good at in Illinois. So Illinois, we have a lot of floodplain. For those of you that don't know, that aren't geographically inclined, our entire western shore is Mississippi River, 600 miles of Mississippi River. Our entire southern coast is the Ohio River. Our eastern coast is the Wabash River. There's a river that flows from Chicago and takes all their sewage down to St. Louis, the Illinois River. And in between, there's a myriad of small tributaries. There's hardly a place in Illinois where you can't throw a rock and hit a floodplain. 2/3 of the nation drains through our country. So if it snows in Saskatchewan or if it's flooding, raining in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we are going to get flooded in Illinois. We know it's an inevitability. We actually have the largest inland system of rivers, lakes, and streams in the whole nation. And for people from California that are freaking out right now, notice I underline the word inland states in the nation. So all that rivers, all that floodplains equates to a lot of disaster declarations. So just subsequent to the 1993 flood, every single county in Illinois, save one, the little yellow Stark County, has had a disaster declaration. In 2008, those stopped. We haven't had a declaration since then, and I'm going to talk about that. So we got serious after the 1993 flood. So going back to our rating as a floodplain management state, we're number 1 in the nation for the overall reduction of repetitive loss properties. Nicholas talked about those. No other state has a greater percent reduction of repetitive loss than Illinois. More importantly, we're number 1 for the fewest number of claims on new buildings. So new buildings simply aren't going into the floodplain. And number 3, we're number 1 in the nation for kicking communities out of the National Flood Insurance Program that don't follow the rules. 75% of the communities in the entire nation that are kicked out of the NFIP are in Illinois. And there's a reason for that. We do a lot of stuff to keep our floodplains open. We define our floodways differently. Rather than a foot rise, which is the FEMA definition, we define our floodways on 1/10 of a foot rise. We don't allow buildings in the floodplain. We only allow appropriate uses. We have compensatory storage, so if you put a brick in the floodplain, you got to take a brick and a half out. We track cumulative substantial damage. We require everything in the state be at least a foot higher than the 100-year flood elevation. Stormwater regulations, a lot of communities have their own regulatory maps that go above and beyond FEMA minimum standards, critical facilities and countywide ordinance, and we find people that violate the regulations. And we know that mitigation works. Managed retreat mitigation is part of that process. We've done about 6,000 buyouts since the 1993 flood. Again, you don't have to be a good geographer to identify the Mississippi and Illinois rivers on this map. Probably the most famous of the buyouts in the whole nation, as Nicholas talked about, is Valmeyer, Illinois. So Valmeyer, you see in the upper left-hand corner there, it sits about 30 miles south of St. Louis. And Valmeyer is 7 miles away from the Mississippi River. The floodplain at that point is about 15 miles wide, and Valmeyer sits well inland. You can't even see the Mississippi River from Valmeyer. And it sits behind several levee systems. They have absolutely no flood history at all until the levee failed in 1993. So about 300 homes and businesses in Valmeyer went underwater. And the guy in the lower left-hand corner down there, Nicholas talked about him, Dennis Knobloch is the mayor. At the risk of pushing my time here, back in 1992, a geologist named Ivan Browning, I don't know if you remember him, predicted that the New Madrid Fault was going to burst. And everything in the Midwest, the central Midwest there, was going to be leveled completely. So Valmeyer, sitting in the floodplain, had a city council meeting, and they decided, well, when our town is flattened, what are we going to do? According to the rules, if they rebuild, they have to go up. And Dennis Knobloch, again, I don't know if I can say this at a scientific conference, but this is what he told me when I said the entire town had to be elevated after the earthquake. He said he was going to beat me up at the city council meeting. 6 months later, Valmeyer was underwater. And the community had a choice to make. Do we elevate all of our houses 10 feet off the ground, or do we move up on the bluff? And they chose the latter. So Valmeyer, 275 of those properties could not be rebuilt. 334 of them were bought out and moved up on the slope. The cost was about $8 million just for the buyout, but probably double that amount for the infrastructure, the roads and the treatment plants and the new schools and all the community infrastructure. And that came down to a cost of about $200,000 per person. And for us, we have to question if it was worth it. I know Valmeyer gets a lot of good press, but really for that value, I'm not sure we got the best benefit-cost ratio. 3 pictures there. You can see old Valmeyer at the top of the screen. The new construction just 2 years later, and that's important to note too. It only took 2 years from the time they were flooded till they started building the new town up on top of the hill. And Valmeyer today, that's a Google Earth photo that I just downloaded a couple of weeks ago. That's what it looks like today. It's almost doubled in size, and it's growing like crazy. It's kind of a St. Louis bedroom community. Another one, again, in the upper left-hand corner is Grafton, Illinois. It's about the same distance north of St. Louis, about 30 miles north of St. Louis. Grafton, Grafton sits right in what's called Death's Triangle. So the Missouri River comes in, the Illinois River comes in, and the Mississippi River all come in, and they kind of confluence right near Grafton. So if any of those 3 rivers flood, Grafton's going to get flooded. And the mayor in Grafton, since we're in New Orleans, the mayor of Grafton's great-grandfather was Colonel John Mosby, who was a kind of a brutal Confederate general, but he's kind of a brutal mayor. So if you look at Grafton, 15 floods at the 100-year flood level since 1903. That's a lot of flooding. They flood almost annually. And there was their strategy, no levee. You look back through the historical records of Grafton, and there's always been a debate, we don't want a levee. We don't want anything blocking our view of the river. So their strategy was run. When they flooded, get out of town. That's always been their strategy. And if you look at, there's 2 houses here. The one on the right is called the Crow's Nest. The ones on the left are all slab-on-grade houses along Water Street for a good reason. All of those houses on Water Street are gone now. But Grafton didn't really have a plan. They didn't do a managed retreat. They've done what I call tactical withdrawal. So over the years since then, they've piecemeal bought out structures, and it's caused kind of a domino effect. Every time there's a flood, more people want to get on that boat and get out of town. So 150 structures bought out, and these are pictures taken from the same location. 50 are elevated. Old Grafton's converted to open space and river trails. New Grafton built up on the bluff, and the total cost about $5 million. Grafton is definitely one where there's been a benefit cost. We've had 6 floods since the buyout, all of which have come close to the 100-year level, and they've been non-events in Grafton. It's like nothing even happened. Grafton has a new marina. They had this riverside bike trail. They have a new visitor center spelled the English way to make it look very nice. New commercial development. They have a winery and a microbrewery in Grafton now, which is just astonishing. So The last one I want to talk quickly about here is Alexander County, Illinois. And Alexander County sits right down in the southern tip of Illinois, right where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together. For the geologists in the room, if you look at that picture on the left, you'll recognize that as meander scars. It sits in probably one of the stupidest locations you could possibly build a community, right in the middle of thousands of years of river channel migration and morphology. 150 structures, $5 million for the buyout. It's all state money that we're using down there. We're doing that right now. We're just actually finishing up the buyout. We tried to do a full-scale location. Nicholas was instrumental in that, but it was difficult to get the funds for the infrastructure cost. Not so much for the buyout, but just for the actual relocation and infrastructure itself. So we're coming on the 25th anniversary of the 93 flood right now. It was a big deal. It scales in comparison to subsequent events we've had in the country, Sandy, Katrina, Harvey. You look at these numbers, and they're not really that impressive now, but back in 1993, this was a massive flood. But we've learned some valuable themes from that. First of all, good mapping and risk awareness are very important. We've got national digital maps now. We've got real-time mapping so people know exactly where it's going to flood and when it's going to flood. We've identified those areas behind the levee that have residual risk. We've realized that removing buildings and people from the floodplain works. There's definitely a benefit-cost ratio in doing that. Strong regs are important. To keep new buildings from going back into the floodplain is just as important as getting those buildings out of the floodplain to begin with. And then lastly, and probably the most important thing, is strong local officials are probably the most important variable of the whole equation. So all the best of communities, they all have these common themes. First of all, they all take ownership. They don't rely on FEMA and state to do the work for them. They do it themselves. They usually have a local champion. They increase outreach. It's not all about fancy products. They have strong regs and they enforce them strictly. They take advantage of mitigation programs and incentives. And they make friends. They know how to make friends and take advantage of those friends to get the job done. So just a couple slides to end here. I'm doing good. I got 4 minutes left. Climate change is happening. There's no doubt about it. We did a study 2 years ago in Illinois, and we found out that rainfall is increasing and temperatures are increasing. Everybody knows it. It's obvious. Unfortunately, our rainfall models that we use are 10 and 20 years old that we use for mapping. What we've noticed is we looked at all the flood claims in Illinois over the last 10 years. And I know this bar graph is small, but all you need to know is that the blue line in the middle there is national flood insurance claims. The others are private sector claims. So if you look at this, and when we analyzed these and dropped them onto GIS, we found that 92% of our damages in Illinois now happen outside of the floodplain. We're no longer flooding in the floodplain. We're having floods in upland areas. So it's the 100th anniversary of World War I right now. In fact, last month, 100 years ago, November 1917, U.S. troops arrived in France. The 42nd Division arrived in France for the first time. The way I look at this, the old enemy is World War I trench warfare. We were on the high ground. The river was in the bottom. There was defined lines. We knew exactly where the enemy was. We knew exactly what we had to do to beat the enemy. The new enemy is kind of like terrorist networks. It pops up all over the place. All over the state, we're having these 10, 12, 13, 14-inch rainfalls in areas outside of the floodplain, and we're getting massive flooding in areas that have never flooded before. So our success is measured in silence. For those of us that are practitioners in this field, this is how we measure our success. If reporters aren't calling, if the media's not calling, if politicians aren't coming into town trying to buy votes, if none of that's happening, we've won. If it's quiet and peaceful, we've won our job. We've done our job. So I'm going to end with one slide. I took this in 1993 flood. This is actually my favorite slide I've ever taken in 30 years of doing this. This is, again, down in Grafton, Illinois. And you'll notice two houses here. So the house on the left is an elevated structure. It's a compliant, elevated building well above the 100-year flood level. You can see that. They've got a good 5 foot of freeboard there above the 100-year flood level. The house on the left is a buyout parcel. It was a house that was substantially damaged, and we subsequently tore it down. If you zoom in on this slide, and I apologize, it's kind of grainy because it's an old 35mm slide, but if you zoom in on this slide, can you see what the guys are doing on the front porch of that house? They got their feet up on the rails, they got beer cans on the rails, and they're fishing in their front yard. This slide summarizes everything that those of us in the field work for. This is the epitome of good floodplain management right here, not a worry in the world. So I'll end with my last slide, again, up on top of New Grafton, in the community that was built up on the bluff, looking down at the site of Old Grafton, all the green space down there along the river, and you can see the Mississippi and the Illinois River confluence right there in front of Grafton. I even have a minute to spare.
We have time for a question or two if anyone would like to talk with Paul.
Sir.
Yeah, you made a good point that there was this town that flooded 8 times, or 8 times within 6 years, and it was, 8 times within the 100-year floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
So just, relating to the public, what a 100-year flood is, it doesn't have any meaning if you're flooding 8 times within an 8-year period.
It does.
Yeah. My point is, is there a way, or should we focus on some type of measure to present to the public what the true impact is, or what the expected impact is?
Yeah, that's actually a long-standing debate among floodplain managers, is this fictitious 100-year flood that doesn't really exist, what that is. The locals don't understand that. Most people don't understand the concept of a 100-year flood. What I use to explain it is if you had a die with 100 faces on it, and one of those faces said flood, if you throw that up every single year, the chance of that flood face landing is your probability of getting that statistical flood. A lot of other countries in the world map their floodplain based on green, yellow, or red, like a street light, high risk, medium risk, low risk. But you're right, the 100-year flood no longer exists. It's based on old rainfall data. Rainfalls have changed. And unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with as far as FEMA mapping. Chris did a great story about that, Chris Joyce, a few months ago about the difficulty of identifying floodplains using old data. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, I enjoyed the presentation, and coming from sort of a background of economics, I was really interested to hear what sort of motivated those communities in the first place to sort of have buyouts and managed retreat, given that the towns themselves were going to be the ones to bear the cost of that. A lot of communities sort of delay and sort of wait for either FEMA or other sort of federal assistance and really rely on sort of, federal level funding rather than expending their own funds on any sort of floodplain management.
So for us, the choice was largely a non-choice for those residents. We have the substantial damage, the 50% rule, and we enforce that very strictly. So once a house is 50% damaged cumulatively over a series of flood, once it reaches that 50% threshold, the owner has 2 choices. You either elevate or you relocate. Those are your 2 choices. So it's for those residents, it's usually not much of a choice. They have to do something. So most of our buyouts, again, I call them tactical withdrawal. It's structure by structure by structure over a period of years moving out. The full large-scale, full managed retreat, boy, those are nearly impossible to do anymore. They're really difficult to do. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, switch these out. Yeah, I will. Joe.
So our next speaker is Joe Tirone, a community leader from Oakwood Beach, Staten Island, going to be telling you about the managed retreat story there following Hurricane Sandy.
Good morning, everyone. I thought that the best way to discuss my abstract would be to somehow transcribe it into a formula. And being that we're here in New Orleans and it's the land of emerald, I thought the best way to do that would be to put it in the form of a recipe, because a recipe, after all, is really a formula. And it's a good way to really see what we did. So, as you can see here, this is what your buyout's supposed to look like. And The prep time is the time, was actually done by the community, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about this morning. And it's from the day of the storm until the governor's announcement about the buyouts, which took almost exactly 4 months. The cook time is from when the governor announced the buyout to when the first person actually got bought out, received their funds, the property was demolished, and returned to nature. The yield in this case is 185 homes. That's how many homes were in the Fox Beach section of Oakwood Beach, which is on the east shore of Staten Island. I shared this recipe with 3 other communities, but unfortunately I did it from my head. I didn't write it down, so I really wish I would have had this, but now here we have it. So, so an additional, I would say, about 550 homes on Staten Island were offered the buyout, and then they went to Long Island and offered over 1,000 people buyouts from Sandy. So let's go over the ingredients. First, you need a repeatedly flooded county or city, which of course was Fox Beach. 1 catastrophic event, Sandy. Several federal agencies and programs, including FEMA, HUD, and CDGB, which is a Community Development Block Grant, which are the monies that are used to fund the buyout. At least 2 successful buyout templates. We were fortunate to have Nashville, Tennessee. Shout out to Tony Plummer there, who helped us, and Essex, New York. A shout out to Randy Douglas. And they tutored us from the beginning to the end. Up to 8 community leaders, that of course was us, the Oakwood Beach Buyout Committee. 1 governor, and we had a darn good one. He was not only smart about this, but showed a tremendous amount of compassion in doing so. Experienced contract processor. ProSource came directly to us from Ohio, where they were processing the buyouts over there. So when they came to us, they really hit the ground running. 3 to 4 local officials, starting with your congressman. Selected press, you have to be very careful with this. You don't want them to have the opportunity to give the wrong message. And then 2 local meeting places, 1 for the community. Our community meetings, we had between 200 and 300 people, and then another meeting place for the committee, which was the 8 of us, which we met once a week right after that first community meeting. As much documented history of flooding and community response you can find, at least 10 testimonials of residents, a lot of research, and if I could have fit more lots, I would have, because it was an unbelievable amount of research that we had to do for ourselves, because this is community-led. And then the most important ingredient is trust. Without trust, there is no way we would have been able to achieve what we achieved. So let's go to the method. The first method was we had to assess our catastrophic event. It will most likely take several weeks before the affected residents and businesses can process much of anything. On Fox Beach Avenue, there were 3 longtime residents who perished in the storm. So those first couple of days, first couple of weeks, was full of despair, and especially for such a close-knit community. But walking the neighborhood during those weeks will have neighbors talking and relying on one another. This is the first thing I saw when I came down Fox Beach Avenue to check out my property. And here's my property. I'm a real estate broker and an investor. This is a investment property of mine, and I thought I might have been okay. The only thing that seemed strange was the street. This is all the tall grass phragmites that were around this whole area, because we were basically in a marsh, and that was compacted from the storm surge of 13 to 15 feet of water and pressed it down to about 8 inches thick. So walking on that, I remember, it was like walking on the moon or on the bottom of the seafloor. It was bizarre. So looking at that, I thought I was okay, but going inside, there was 8 feet of water inside, so all the contents just swirled around and just ended up wherever. My tenants left after 1 week. They actually moved to Arkansas because they didn't want to deal with FEMA and all the distraught, and they were obviously distraught themselves. And here's the cleanup started. The New York City Sanitation Department was absolutely phenomenal. They were the unsung heroes. What they did to help the residents clean up was just phenomenal. And you can see across the street how closely these bungalows were to each other. And then this is a picture of Kissam Avenue, where several of the houses, 3 or 4 of them, were picked up with the foundations, and they were thrown about 300-400 yards inland towards Mill Road, and that was just quite a scene. It made a lot of the papers. New York Times had an article. So the second part of our process is we identified the local officials and the press, and we set them aside in this recipe. And the reason for that is because this is a bottom-up approach. This is from community-led. Had it been the other way around, this would be the end. Right here is local officials would take over, they would control the press, and you're done. But ours is a bottom-up. So the next thing we did was we held our meeting. We found an acceptable local meeting place big enough so that it will accommodate the potential number of participants. This will aid greatly in getting participants to feel comfortable and perhaps simmer down. I use the word simmer on purpose. This is a recipe. But that was very important because at this time, just a couple of weeks after the storm, people are full of despair. They are full of angst and anger. And so to get them to feel comfortable is the first step in actually getting something done. So here we were very fortunate as part of this miracle buyout is St. Charles School was in the neighborhood just outside the other side of Mill Road, actually the other side of Highland Boulevard, so inland a little bit. And the school made their auditorium available to us right from the beginning because miraculously this is one of the only structures that did not lose power from day one from the storm. So people knew of the schools, several people sent their children there, so they were very comfortable to go there. Inside, this is after one of our meetings, I would sit there on the stage with other committee members and we would answer questions as individuals wanted to know, is this going to be something that I can actually be part of, because they thought their own circumstance might be different. So then we identified the boundaries of the area. The area should be easy to identify after the storm as affected residents step forward, add community leaders, and mix thoroughly. And again, we were very fortunate because our 8 committee members, out of the 185 homes, I don't think there was one family that didn't know at least 2 or 3 committee members. So that helped to build trust, and that was, as I told you, one of the most important ingredients. And then right here with the map that we used, this is the area that we decided right here, this section, which is the Fox Beach section of Oakwood Beach. And this map, I thought I would show you this is the actual map that we used. Someone on the committee worked for DEP and sort of borrowed this map because this is a map that DEP was using with DEC. And they were looking at this map, identifying parcels that they can buy out to expand the Blue Belt. Because remember, this is just one big marsh. Even up around here, you can't really tell from there, there's a lot of marsh and estuaries going through. And so at the same time, as I said in my abstract, the New York City Building Department was issuing building permits. So it's just kind of an insane type of competition. So that's why we really thought from the beginning that we had a chance to qualify for a buyout. And this is another shot. This is another one that we use, a Google map, Google Earth, and you can see us right here. This little housing peninsula, and this one here are the 2 areas that were the first ones to get bought out. Then we created our presentation. We selected a meeting place for community leaders to gather on a regular basis using buyout templates. From successfully run programs, carefully map the boundaries of your area and make sure that all residents are aware of your efforts. You set aside that map. Using research, gather documentations of the history of flooding for the area, and further document how the community responded. Stir in FEMA requirements, making sure that the information that you have gathered proves that your area qualifies. And this stirring in the FEMA requirements is one of the more exciting aspects of what we were doing as a committee, because it was my job to work with Nashville, Tennessee, and upstate New York to learn what the criteria was, and they were tutoring me from day one. The rest of the committee, most of them actually had formed a committee in 1992. Remember, these are long-time residents. And in 1992, they formed a committee to advocate for a seawall after a storm. It was an unnamed storm. It was a nor'easter, brought in about 5 to 7 feet of storm surge. So they had all this information in hard copy. This wasn't like a Google thing where we Googled this and that. They brought hard copies. So I would come up with the criteria and or the eligibility requirements, and then they would pull a piece of paper out of their folder and say, yes, we comply with that, we comply with that. So we knew we were really on to something. Top that off with testimonials from residents, which on my website, which is Fox Beach 165, I created at the time, Fox Beach, one word, the number's 165. I put up testimonials from residents who talked about what their experience was before and especially during the storm. Do not let this cool. This is your buyout template. This is what you're going to present to ultimately the governor. Next, we got the participants signed up. Community leaders should first take presentation to the community members and have each sign a document that they recognize that the program is voluntary and that they would like to participate. Show that your community is united and organized. Now, by them signing this document, that showed that we were united. Everyone said, I want to be a part of this. Then, in the slide before that, in the method 5, we had the document that we wanted to present, so it showed that we were organized. And actually, the governor recognized that by using those same 2 words that we were using, saying we're buying them out because they're united and they're organized. Add press and elected officials according to taste. So what happened was we would never let any member of the press into any of our meetings because we were afraid that they were going to give the wrong message. They're not organized, they're in disarray, whatever. Dana Rubenstein from Capital New York, an online magazine, came in and she interviewed us. We were a little bit worried, but this is when we really realized that we had a very good chance of being successful because this got the message out of Staten Island. And it was very well written. She said exactly what we said to her and didn't embellish at all. And that we felt gave rise to the governor and made him aware of what we were doing. And then that also gave rise to an article that Tom Kaplan did where he talks about Cuomo thinking buyouts, and here's this community that wants to participate. So at this point, we knew we felt we were going to be successful, and Staten Island is very provincial, it's very insular, and we were afraid, our biggest fear, that this whole exercise, all our efforts was just going to die on Staten Island. This proved that that was being possible at this point. Next thing is you present to the governor, which is what we did, but now the governor will know what you're up to. Let the governor decide how to process the buyout through CDGB, and he worked an absolute miracle the way he did it. Contact your congressman and let your congressman know that they need to get these funds appropriated that the governor is asking for, and bake for 2 months and wait for federal approval. Make certain that all community participants hand in all the required paperwork to the contract processor, and you let stand for 6 months. So this is the governor at his State of the State address when he announced the buyout. And this is what your recipe should look like. This was filled with homes, including in the back over here where you see these phragmites. In there was about another maybe 15 homes that were set inside of that. Sort of incredulous, but that's welcome to Staten Island. And here's another picture when I told you I first came down Fox Beach. Now you can see it's all returned to nature. And this is 87 Fox Beach, which was my property that you saw before, what it looks like today. So there's an asterisk here. This is the high altitude directions, I'm calling it. If the buyout is top down, so it's from the government officials down, you carefully stir in your state assembly member, your state senator, New York City council member, and you add HMGP, which actually does sound like a spice, but it's actually the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And if you access the buyout through that, what happens is you have to apply with what they call a local jurisdiction. In Staten Island, we're a separate county, but the revenue-producing entity is New York City, so it has to go through the New York City Council. So New York City Council member is your most important advocate. There's only 3 council members on Staten Island. There's 46 council members in the New York City Council. So what are the chances of their voice being heard and the whole process, which takes forever? So therefore, you would increase your standing time 2 to 4 years. And that is my recipe for a community-led buyout.
Thank you, Jeff. George? Our next speaker is George Homewood from City of Norfolk, talking about planning to be the coastal community of the future in a rising water environment.
All right, good morning. Appreciate all of you all coming here today. I'm George Homewood. I'm the planning director for the city of Norfolk, and I want to talk about how we are planning for resilience in Norfolk. So where is Norfolk? We're on the eastern coast of Virginia. We are the second largest city by population in the Commonwealth of Virginia, although we are clearly the largest authentic urban area in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are host to the world's largest naval base and the Port of Virginia, which is either 2 or 3 on the largest on the East Coast, depending on how you count it. We're part of the Hampton Roads region of Virginia, which consists of 17 independent communities. They're all independent because Mr. Jefferson wanted it that way. I should mention that in Virginia, the first question we always ask on policy is, what would Mr. Jefferson do? We have a large employment base that is defense related. So the Department of Defense is our largest economic actor in the city. We are very much a city defined by water. And our water gives us lots and lots of benefits, but there in the middle you also see that it gives us lots of problems as well. What's interesting about that picture in the middle is that is not as a result of a storm. That is the result of a full moon and high tide. Thus, it happens almost monthly in our city. So very much we are concerned with water. We are the second most at-risk city to sea level rise, second only to New Orleans, where we are today. And sea level rise in Norfolk is caused not just by global warming and sea level rise, but there's a few other things going on. We have land subsidence driven by the fact that we've been harvesting groundwater for at least the last 100 years. There's still residual kinetic energy from the impact of the asteroid that created the Chesapeake Bay a year or 2 ago. We also, because of the general global warming, for most of you may or may not, you all will be aware, the Gulf Stream is slowing down, and what that's doing is it's piling up water off of the mid-Atlantic coast, and happens to be, we're right at ground zero in that. We, like many coastal communities of the colonial era, we filled in and we created more land, and all of those streams and wetlands were determined to be nuisances and could be improved by adding land to them and therefore expanding the city. And we now flood exactly where we filled. We have an awful lot of streams that once were transportation arteries and served ships coming from the sea. We filled them in, turned them into roads, and then guess what? Those roads now flood every time we have a summer rain bomb. Among other things, this proves that draining the swamp is not always a really good public policy. We also, as a result of the increasing sea level rise, what that's going to do for us is create increased flood risks over the next, it's already started, and over the next 100 years, it's going to create a lot more risk. So we look at sea level rise, and we think in terms of, we're planning, looking at something in the 2 meters range over 100 years, and that's only going to impact, in terms of inundation, about 7% of the city. However, we get up to about 40% of the city when we think about what's the future floodplain going to look like. And I, by the way, agree with many of my colleagues that this concept and construct that FEMA continues to use of the 100-year floodplain is something that we as a community need to address, because it is no longer relevant in an era of rising seas. So we started with the traditional approach. The traditional approach could be best described as, we're going to build a wall, or we're going to build it deep, we're going to build it tall, and we're going to find somebody else to pay for it. In our case, we were hoping the federal government. But that's not really reality. And while structural resilience is part of our plan and part of what we're thinking that we have to do, it is not the entire part of our plan. The Corps is working on, and will soon finish up, a strategy that is more structurally based than non-structurally based, partly because that's what the Corps does, but also partly because if we don't have some sort of structural barriers, we'll essentially flood our downtown from the backside, even though the front side is already protected by a flood wall. One of the things that I noticed walking around late yesterday afternoon is that you get down into the French Quarter and you walk across from Jackson Square, and you have to climb stairs to be able to see the Mississippi River. And the reason for that, of course, is that there is a flood wall between the river and the French Quarter. And while that is a really good thing in terms of protecting from floods, floods happen once every so often, but views of the river and views of the water are an everyday occurrence. And to lose that, you begin to lose the essence of your city. At least that's what we have decided in the city of Norfolk. So we are trying, while we're looking at some structural things, we are trying some other non-structural as well. Norfolk was one of the original cohort of the 100 Resilient Cities, as was New Orleans, and that process has helped us figure out what it means to be resilient. And that definition at the bottom of the slide, that is that we are going to be able to accept and shocks and stresses and bounce back. And not only are we just going to bounce back, we're going to bounce back better. So we're going to adapt and grow in the face of challenges. And so in Norfolk, that's a three-legged stool. And if this sounds a little bit like sustainability, it sort of is, but it's much, much bigger than that. So we need to, of course, coastal resilience in the face of climate change and sea level rise, but also economic resilience. I think I mentioned earlier that the Department of Defense is a huge component of our economy. And what we have learned over the last several years, unfortunately, is the federal government is not a reliable partner in our economy. So we need to diversify, and we need to be able to address the shocks and stresses caused by decisions made in Washington over which we have absolutely no control. And finally, we need to develop a social or a neighborhood resilience around strengthening our neighborhoods and strengthening those social systems that knit and tie our population and our citizens together. And all of that we consider as part of our resilience strategy, which we developed and published in 2015 with the goal of becoming the coastal community of the future. The identified challenges are, guess what? Coastal resilience, economic resilience, and neighborhood resilience. We also in 2015 hosted the Dutch Dialogues. This is something that also happened here in New Orleans after Katrina, and it, quite frankly, that's the day that everything changed for us in Norfolk, the way we started in the way we're thinking. So instead of the concept that we need to protect ourselves from the water, we decided that our new mantra is that we're going to live with water, and that water is our friend. We have places in the city where, as I mentioned before, we filled. We have the opportunity now to daylight those creeks and give them back to the water that they once had. I have a friend of mine who, instead of choosing planning, went to the dark side and went into real estate development, and he always said, the great thing about waterfront property is God isn't making any more of it. Well, guess what? We think we may have found a way by daylighting creeks to actually create more waterfront property. And in a city that is defined by water, that is probably a very good thing to do. Part of our idea of stormwater protection, even where we talk about structural means, we want to create structural means that are nature-based so that we don't cut off the citizens and cut off property of our city from the water, which is what defines us. We also believe that in terms of resilience, every single investment we make as a city should have co-benefits. That is to say, it shouldn't be a single-purpose investment. Every investment, so if we're going to build a berm, that berm on the top is going to have a bike trail. and we're going to try to create recreational opportunities around the berm as well, so that everything we do has more than one benefit and benefits our citizens in as many ways as we possibly can. I want to talk a little bit about Vision 2100, which was this extremely groundbreaking, unique idea that a city, and audacious as can be, that a city can and should look out 100 years toward its future. Why did we pick 100 years? Well, this idea of sea level rise, it's an insidious type of thing. It happens a little bit at a time, and it's not like a storm like Sandy, where all of a sudden it's there and you have to deal with the aftermath. This is something that just keeps creeping up on you, and so we needed a longer timeline to be able to understand how it's going to impact our city. And so while it addresses other things, it is quintessentially a strategy for addressing sea level rise. What we did was we decided to go out to the citizens. Several people have already talked about the fact that it is absolutely critical that everything we do in planning should be a bottom-up approach. Because when you're talking about a resilient future, it's the citizens that are going to make that resilient future. It's not the government. And so we went out to the communities and we said to them, folks, what are those people, places, things, and events that make Norfolk, Norfolk? What is it that if we didn't have, we would be just another big city without our identity? So we tried to find those identity factors, those identity assets, and put them on a map. And then we went, and after we figured out what they were, we tried to find a way to define how important they were. Because one thing might be an asset, but it's not nearly as important as another asset. So, for example, we found that our naval base and our port and our downtown are pretty big assets. Oddly enough, our citizens think that our botanical gardens is a huge asset, and some of the other cultural activities. Norfolk is very much the cultural center of Hampton Roads and really Eastern Virginia. And so our citizens recognize the value of those assets. And so we mapped all that together, and that led us to creating a vision for the future. And we added risk and assets, and we said to ourselves, okay, there are some assets that are really important, but they're transportable. They just have to be someplace in our city. There are other assets that are not quite so transportable. You know, for example, those big gray things that the Navy parks at the piers at Naval Station Norfolk are not going to be relocated to West Virginia anytime soon because they have to be on the water. And so looking at it in that way, we created a matrix that measured risk and asset value, and that asset value is not in dollars but in identity. And from that, we created 4 vision areas for the city. The red areas are the ones that we're going to figure out how to protect. If we've got to figure that out because those are the ones that are high identity value assets that are not very transportable. The yellow ones, on the other hand, are where we think we're going to learn to live with water. If there is going to be retreat in Norfolk, we think it's going to be from the yellow areas. Problem is, that's probably the most valuable real estate we have in the entire city. So it's not the easiest thing to do over time. But we also are firm believers that technology, remember, 11 years ago, there was no such thing as an iPhone. Anybody who doesn't have an iPhone, raise your hand. Yeah, okay, 2 out of the entire audience. I can make up for that because I carry 2 of them. So the point is technology is changing, and technology is going to bring benefits to us moving forward. And so that's what our future for the yellow areas are. Purple and green are our economic opportunities of the future, and to maintain our stable neighborhoods. We created an implementation strategy. All of this, by the way, is online, and I don't expect you to track it on the slides, for each of the areas, and that give us our approaches to resilience. In addition, we've adopted the most stringent zoning regulations relative to the floodplain anywhere in Virginia, and we're about to adopt the most forward-thinking, progressive zoning ordinance anywhere in Virginia, perhaps in America, dealing with resilience going forward. We believe that's going to be adopted on January 23rd, and it will quite literally change things. It includes various strategies. Again, all the slides are available to you, and I knew I was going to run short on time. Probably the most interesting thing we have is the resilience quotient, which is a point system that is now going to be required for all new development, redevelopment in the city, where people are going to have to focus on the resilience impacts of their proposed development. And we've created some resilience overlays. I'm out of time, but the bottom line is through zoning, we've decided that there's sort of this middle 80% or so that can be addressed directly through zoning, and then the outliers on both the top and the bottom we're going to need to address through some sort of a managed process, probably a legislative process in some ways. So that's where I am. I am over time. So I guess I can't take any questions, or can I?
At the end.
At the end. All right. There's my information. If you have need any more information from me, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So our next speaker is Matt Sanders. He's with the Louisiana Office of Community Development, going to be talking about LA Safe, I assume that's Louisiana, not Los Angeles, and Ile de Jean Charles, Regional Adaptation and Community Resettlement Planning.
Thank you. So I'll talk about two programs currently underway in the state of Louisiana, LA Safe and the resettlement of Ile de Jean Charles. I think they're both relative to managed retreat, but at different scales. Before I dive into either of those programs, though, so I often show this particular image of coastal Louisiana, and this is, if you were to map out Louisiana as it currently exists, without any of the open water, without any of the marshland, without any of the wetlands, this is really what we're working with. And so if you were to think through what the building footprint looks like, what the development footprint is, it's really this finite piece of land. And I talk about this imagery because it really relates to the idea that land is a commodity in the state of Louisiana, and we're unfortunately losing it. And so we have to make development decisions with that idea in mind. I would posit to my friend from Illinois who said that they have all of the corruption, but they're very good at floodplain management. In Louisiana, we have all of the corruption, and we're terrible at floodplain management. So to illustrate that, this is St. John the Baptist Parish, and I talk about this relative to Hurricane Isaac, which for this particular community was a 100-year flood event. This is the flood insurance rate map. You can see the area that outlines the 100-year floodplain. Guess what? When Isaac happened and was a 100-year event for this particular community, FEMA was more or less right. The places that we thought would flood did flood. The places we thought would be high and dry were more or less high and dry. To illustrate why that's a problem for us, this is a zoomed-in view of a piece of that parish. This is Laplace, Louisiana. You can see the high ground core along the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, we have paid no regard to that high ground core, and each of these yellow dots represents population. And so we have sprawled into the floodplain out toward Interstate 10. And this is fairly indicative of our coastal environment in the state of Louisiana. And so we have made development decisions over time in flagrant disregard of the places that we would reasonably expect to flood. Again, that's what flooded out. And you can see that area north toward I-10 where people are living, and they uniformly flooded out. LA Safe, or Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments, is a program that we launched with $40 million from HUD. We received a $92.6 million award at the end of the National Disaster Resilience Competition. This program is attempting to take a regional approach across the 6 parishes you see here. Those are St. Tammany, Plaquemine, Jefferson, Lafourche, Terrebonne, and St. John the Baptist. And it's the idea that can we use the information that we have at our disposal relative to future and current flood conditions to effectuate some large-scale regional planning and ultimately a behavioral change to alleviate the condition that I just illustrated, right? We don't want to make development decisions that disregard what we know about current and future flood risk. We've set this up in such a way that it's very intensive on community outreach. We're actually in the middle of our final round of outreach and engagement events now. I'll get into a little more detail on that in a minute. But over the course of this year, we've had roughly 60 some odd individual outreach and engagement events across that 6-parish area, in which we've really started with the idea that we were going to put all of the information that we have at the table down on the table and start a conversation with the communities themselves, and then now work to a place where we're developing a plan and we're developing demonstration projects that we'll ultimately invest in. So I talked a little bit about the fact that the state of Louisiana is disappearing. One of the things we started with was going down to these parishes and these communities themselves and talking about the landform of the state. And so in 1960, we had this nice, well-defined boot-like structure that represented the state of Louisiana. Unfortunately, today, that boot no longer exists. It's now this very skeletal-looking thing. If we don't do anything in the future, the skeleton disappears, and some higher populations, areas like Homewood, Thibodeau, become coastal communities in and of themselves. We're not going to do nothing. So in the state of Louisiana, we have something called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and they release a plan called the Coastal Master Plan on a 5-year loop. And so the latest incarnation of that came out this year. And essentially, the function of the Coastal Master Plan is to rebuild and preserve as much of that land mass as possible, while also building out structural protection systems to protect as many people and communities as possible. Unfortunately, we know with the best information we have at our disposal that we're likely to lose more land than we can reasonably rebuild or protect over the next 50 years. And so if we're dealing with a construct in which we have a high degree of flood risk today in the state of Louisiana, and it's expected to get worse, that's largely represented by what we can expect in changes to the landform. To further highlight that, this represents current surge flood risk, and so the darker blue areas are those places that would experience more severe events. If we don't do anything, the map gets very, very blue. We're not going to do nothing. It gets a little less blue with the implementation of the structural protection projects we have in store. But compared to today, we can reasonably expect a higher degree of risk over time. And so that forms the crux of the message that we've gone to our respective communities with. And we've also pointed out that people have already started to make decisions based on what they've experienced in terms of severe repetitive flooding events. And we talk about the elevation map because, those places that are naturally higher and drier, they are, in fact, receiving populations. And what we've seen over time is that as populations have left our lower-lying, more vulnerable environments, we've also experienced a decline in median incomes. And so you can infer from that the folks that have the financial ability to make a decision to move upland to protect their own homesteads are largely doing so, and what's left behind are often very poor communities that experience other levels of social and cultural degradation. So on the LA Safe project, we started with this idea that we wanted to use 3 buckets of expertise. And so one is the type of information that I just illustrated, but the other is what we could figure out from the grassroots perspective, right? And so working with communities on the ground, it's one thing to say, here's how landform has changed, here's what we know about flood risk, here's what we anticipate in the future. It's another thing to talk to a fisherman that says, well, yeah, your map largely squares with the area that used to be marshland and now it's open water, whitecaps, and I've seen that change happen over the last 20 years. The third thing that we wanted to bring in was planning expertise. And so we built out a pretty robust team of planners to help us think through what the redevelopment of our coastal environment is ultimately going to look like. So we found out something really interesting, and when we went to the the local communities themselves with information outlining current and future flood risk. Funny thing happened. People largely said, well, you know, if we think it's going to flood over here, then maybe we should build over there. And so it's highly intuitive, and I think it's encouraging that when presented with good information, people have largely outlined what a future development pattern should look like therein. And what we've started to do is build out what is in essence a large-scale future land use map. And it's with the idea that those places that would be more prone to flooding events over time should be those places that are essentially returned to nature, become recreational economies, become places where, you know, maybe somebody has a camp and uses it for fishing purposes, but it's not a primary residence. So we've developed a series of strategies over the past year that are beginning to make up what will be a final plan that we'll release here in the first quarter of next year. But it's all around the idea of how do we orient our land uses based on the current and future articulation of the floodplain. One of the things that we've really gotten from this process is large-scale buy-in with the notion that places that have high risk should be of less residential density. We don't want to build in places that are likely to flood out. I noticed some of the fellow panelists here that probably sounds intuitive and something that you all have been doing in your own communities for a long time. But that's kind of a new construct in Louisiana. We have a really heartfelt attachment to personal property rights. We want to be able to use the land and the water in the ways that we've used them for generations. And so to introduce a different set of ideas has been a very difficult thing for a lot of people to swallow. But in this case, in those high-risk areas where we talk about losing population, we talk about transitioning to a recreational economy, that's been an idea that has largely grown legs. In those moderate risk places, we would talk about, trying to implement some of those structural mitigation and non-structural strategies to essentially hold down the fort, maintain a current population level, maintain a current set of economic activities, allow the status quo, if you will. But then finally, in the low-risk areas, we talk about that very limited development opportunity that is the state of Louisiana, right? And so we have to build density in those areas. And we've gotten a lot of buy-in with the idea that we can and should build density where it's naturally going to be higher and drier. So from that, we've developed out the makings of a plan that will finish early next year, as well as some demonstration projects. We're actually in the middle of our last round of engagement events now, receiving some public input on what we'll ultimately invest in. So just to highlight a few of those ideas that have risen to the fore. This one I'll point out is fairly interesting. This is Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, and this idea would essentially, combined with the resettlement of Village on Charles that I'll mention in a minute, would bring every permanent resident household inside of the Morganza to the Gulf structural protection system, which is currently under construction. And so this would be the first parish in Louisiana that would essentially have every permanent resident household inside of a significant protection system. I talked about density and building out housing prototypes. I'll point out this particular idea. This is in St. Tammany Parish, and this is a fairly unimproved tract of land in which we would build out housing at scale, at density, and build in water management implementations. And so it's the idea, can we build out different types of developments where they don't currently exist? Those that account for water, those that build at a higher density. So that's the general idea. End up with a 6 parish plan that will represent a region. Like I said, in a couple of months we'll release that and invest in a few projects. Which moves me into the resettlement of Village on Charles. So if LA Safe thinks about the managed retreat concept at a regional perspective, Ile-de-Jean Charles is very much a micro community-based approach. Those of you that may have some familiarity with this particular locale, it's an island in remote southeastern Terrebonne Parish. It's historically a tribal community. The island itself is disappearing. We think at best it has about 50 years before it erodes away entirely. But anything more significant than a Category 3 hurricane or so would largely wipe out the island at that juncture. So this is the landmass of Ile-de-Jean Charles in 1963, and this is what it looks like today. It's lost between 95 and 98% of the landmass in the surrounding area. There's one road in, one road out. It's called Island Road. It washes out about 50 days out of the year. You can't really see, well, you can see it the left side of the screen. There's that road leading to the mainland. It has water on either side of it. So we broadly developed this project in 3 phases. First phase was last year. We talked about just initial outreach and development of a needs assessment. And so one of the things we did, there's about 100 people that live on the island, 37 households. We need to know each and every one of them if we're going to be able to effectively design out a new version of their community. And so a lot of the work that we've done is sitting on porches and living rooms, really getting to know people, understanding the value systems at play, and working to figure out how we can build out this new community. Right now, we're currently under site selection, and we've brought in a master planning team to help us figure out what will ultimately be 2 plans. One, what does the end game look like for the island? How do we effectuate that long goodbye in a tactful, responsible way, while also thinking through what the new community ultimately becomes? How does it feel? How does it function? How does it sustainable? One of the things we think about all the time, at least from an economic perspective, how is this a self-sustaining community that maintains itself economically over time without public intervention? Finally, we'll move into development and construction, which we're planning for sometime next year. As I mentioned, the phase 1 assessment that we finished, you can find this online. It was really a granular level approach to outreach and an initial idea of what the island is. And so this was a census, it was a round of outreach, and it was also a physical assessment of the assets and infrastructure on the island itself. One of the things that we think about quite a bit is the idea that, at some point we're going to have to pick up shop, if you will, right? We don't want to leave infrastructure and structures in place on the island that then become debris for their neighbors in the event of a future hurricane. And so as part of that assessment, we've compiled a wealth of data, understanding the island itself from a physical perspective, but also, getting to know the residents. And so sight unseen, without a piece of property purchased, without any understanding of what the move will ultimately look like, there's about half and half wholesale buy-in compared to some degree of maybe. And so the goal is, if we design out this community with a participatory process that includes all the folks that live on the island, we have every expectation that everybody will be in that yes camp and will move collectively to the new community. So as part of that, we've begun to develop out some initial concepts as to what's important to the people that live on the island that we would then incorporate into the new community and the programs around it. I like to talk about this image because it relates to site selection. And so when we were going through our site selection process, the first question we asked was, well, where would you like for this community to move? I saw a slide in one of the previous presentations that said it's very important to move a community in very close proximity. That's unfortunately not an option here. And so if we're going to responsibly move this community in a place that we think it can reasonably be well protected over time, we're going to have to move it about 30 miles north. And so the areas that we've outlined here as the no-build zone, if you will, are those areas that are currently within a V zone in the flood insurance rate map, or are those areas that we would expect to experience prohibitively high surge events over time. I mentioned community outreach and engagement. That's been a key portion of this project as well. I actually haven't updated this. We had our last meeting on Saturday, so this was the meeting before that. But it's really trying to effectuate a large-scale community conversation and then work from there. Thank you. Right on time.
So our last speaker before the panel discussion that we're going to convene afterwards is Donald Bogen. He's with the Bayou Interfaith Shared Community Organization. Let's find your PowerPoint.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is Donald Bogen. I am the co-director of BISCO, Bayou Interfaith Shared Community Organizing. And I want to talk a little bit with you today about academics and citizens working together. So I want to come from the perspective of story sharing, what's been my experience with working with academics and the experience of the community. Relationships matter. Traditionally, academics and citizens have contributed to each other, but friction has always existed. I work in Lafourche and Terrebonne Parish. We have been affected by many national disasters, man-made, hurricanes, all spill. And one of the things that always happen is that academics will come in, researchers will come in, and they will require data from us. So we will be asked to go to our community leaders, go to community meetings, get surveys, get people to come out, give blood, saliva, wherever it may be. Now, the problem with that is that without a relationship between the academics, the community people easily get burnt out because they never see results, and there's not a relationship where they can go to someone to get those results. And when you have another disaster without trust, it makes for a disaster in and of itself. So how do we strengthen relationships, combining community-based participatory research and using our BISCO community organizing model, which is listen, identify, research, and offer solutions. So one of the things we say, instead of coming into the community and asking for information, how about you guys sit down with us beforehand and build a relationship? Now, using the community-based participatory research method, that will allow the researchers and community leaders to lay out the plan of action, how we're going to research this practice, how we're going to research this problem. And using the organizing model, it will allow for personal relationships to be developed between community leaders and the researchers. Trust in the relationship. Using this practice of community organizing, where you listen and you learn from each other and you go together in work groups, developing personal relationships matter because once there are problems during the research phase, you can rely on those personal relationships. Telling personal stories matter. As I mentioned earlier, you're asked to come into our community, go get surveys, you're asked to get saliva, you're asked to get blood, whatever the research may be. But if there's not a personal relationship, then the community citizens would be hesitant to be fully involved within the research. And whenever the researchers can't get the adequate data, then the solution is hard to come about, and therefore the research suffers because there's not a relationship between the community and the academics. So listening to each other, creating space where you can learn from each other. If you're going to ask me for my blood, you're going to ask me for my saliva, I might want to know a little bit about yourself. And going through this method, we have discovered building these trusting relationships actually makes the works go a lot better. Knowing our limitations. As a community organizer, again, being repetitive, when I'm asked to go get a survey in Lower Lafourche or Lower Terrebonne, in the area where there's a whole lot of fishermen that have been working on their boats for all of their lives, the literacy rate is not there. So therefore, you have a 40-page survey that the researchers need this data to help come about a solution or to give us the data so we can get grants or continue to fund whatever effort we're seeking, outcome we're seeking. You're not going to get the data points that you need by going into these fishing communities, working with low income and low literacy rate people, trying to get a 40-page survey filled out. So if we work together and we know our limitations right up front and we know where we're going through the participatory-based community research effort, if we know where we can go right up front and we know who we're going to target up front, then it might not be a survey where they had to fill out 40 pages of questionnaire. It might be something with storytelling, historical storytelling in those communities, or some type of way we can draw that data from those citizens. And we need each other. Academics cannot produce good data if citizens withhold information. Again, if the citizens withhold information, you will not have the data you need. Understanding that researchers come to it from the point of view that they're looking to gather data so they can publish. Citizens come to it from the point of view to where they're looking to use their data to better their lives. I want to share a quick story with you guys right before I wrap up. When I first started organizing, I've been doing this for over 11 years. I started organizing in Lower Lafourche and Thibodaux and Upper Thibodaux, and in Terrebonne organizing in Hummer and Chauvin, Lower Terrebonne. And one of the things what happened after the BP spill was that there was a whole bunch of researchers, a whole bunch of academics came into our community, and they wanted data points, right? They wanted to test the water, they wanted to test the seafood, and they came with this plan already put together. Hey, I'm going to pay you to use your boat. I'm going to pay you for your gas, where the fishermen, a lot of them was hurting. All right, you get on my boat, tell me where you want to go. They already had the points where they wanted to go. So what the fishermen's done, they brought those researchers exactly to where they wanted to go. They went to wherever bays they wanted them to go to, collected whatever species they was asked to collect, whatever samples of water they wanted to collect. And then when the researchers left in community meetings, the things that we were saying was that, I don't know why they went out there. I don't know why they collected this fish. I don't know why they tried to get crabs from over there. And so in my mind, that data that those researchers collected is going to be useless, garbage in, garbage out, because there was not a relationship up front. So working in the community and working with academics, I learned a lot. I learned a lot because one of the things I had a negative connotation about academics up front because of the problem that I shared with you guys earlier is that I always thought that they came into our communities, they parachuted in, they collected data, they went to the wrong spots, they talked to the wrong people, and then we never heard from them again. And usually there wasn't a phone number where you can pick up and call someone. There's the number you got, was an 800 number, or you got a website to go to collect the data. And then the data, when you tried to read the data as a community person, you could not understand it because it was on a high level. And so from that perspective, I had a negative connotation towards academics. But working with Tulane and working with, I believe it was LPHI at the time, we sat down and we came up with a plan of how can we approach this research. I've been part of the process with Matt, working with LA Safe, and it's similar to that. Up front, went to lead the coast. Up front, how can we approach this problem? What can the citizens offer to us? And as researchers, what can we offer to the citizens? Knowing our limitations, encouraging each other, makes the work go a lot faster. Now, I had the negative connotation, but at first, when we began the process, we made room, we shared stories. Who am I? I have 6 kids, I have a wife, I'm this in the community, I'm that in the community. Nothing about the work, all about myself. I learned about the researchers, how many kids they had, what they like to do in their off time, how they got into the work. And anyone out there that is a researcher or academic that's thinking about going into a community, be ready to share why you got into work. Be passionate about why you got into work. When a community person hear about why you got into work, they don't identify you or associate you with a university. They identify you as a person, and then they feel comfortable to where they can ask you questions. You know, we always thought that there's no such thing as a dumb question, but they're not going to ask you a question if they think that you're going to judge them, or they think that, hey, I've been on the boat my whole life, I'm not educated like this person. And if they're not asking you the right question, they're not able to redirect you to the right points where you could collect your data, once again, garbage in to garbage out. So we need each other. In order for the work to be better, we have to be better. Creating those opportunities, the work groups where we are able to share on a personal level, it helps the work. There was a situation that I was in to where I was challenged by one of our community members about a particular research effort we was doing. I was able to talk on the behalf of that researcher because I knew why they got involved in the work, I knew why they was passionate about the work, and I knew that the bottom line is that where he worked, that his job was to publish. Up front, I was told, down at the end of this, my job is to publish this research. There's no funds. I'm going to say that again. There's no funds for me to go on. But what I can do for your community, I can give you this data, help you with this data, explain this data to you, and how you can use this data. So we have to know how to work with each other. We have to be upfront with each other. We have to form those personal relationships and create those space to work with each other so we can have better data. Now, through that process of working, I'm proud to say that BISCO was able to get a grant of $275,000 to work with a group of citizens for citizen science from NAS based on our work that we've done with the universities, working with RAND Corporation. We're looking to take 15 community citizens into the field, teach them different scientific methods, teach them how to use different scientific equipment based on our relationships that we now form and continue to form with academics. Thank you.
So we've carefully hoarded some of our allotted time here to have a little bit of discussion with the panel. And what I'd suggest is I have an opening question, maybe, Chris, and if you want to follow that, and then we want to make sure that there's time for the audience to chime in and participate in this discussion as well. So I'll just lead off since I got the podium. I think what you've heard here, we've talked a lot about managed retreat. This is a new area of research, but also a policy imperative. So what you've seen here is some from us scientists and an awful lot from planners and citizens in the affected areas. The necessity of managed retreat, I think everyone would agree here, is universally accepted. That sea level rise, you've seen the pictures of the Louisiana Delta, inescapable. Increasing storm frequency and magnitudes, again, growing scientific consensus on that. And we are dealing with the results of poor planning decisions in the past. Again, I think everyone who's dealt with this, Paul can tell you about plenty of mistakes on the floodplain in the past. So with this imperative behind us, again, we've tried in this session to have a practical bent. So what are the effective, so we'll pose this to the panel. What are the practical, effective, and cost-effective investments for lowering flood risk and increasing resilience in the future? And if I may just suggest, I think we heard an interesting difference of opinion this morning. So Paul expressed some skepticism, for example, that even for Valmeyer, the poster child for community relocation, he expressed some skepticism that that was a cost-effective solution for reducing the flood risk in that community. Whereas Joe maybe presented a slightly more optimistic view. You presented certainly more successful timetable than some of the other examples that we've seen. Are we headed in the right path? Are investments in managed retreat the way of the future, or are they maybe good poster children? Is there something to be learned for the Louisiana Delta, for Arctic Alaska, and elsewhere? Panelists, maybe give us your thoughts.
I'll just start as the bureaucrat. So as a state official, we look at it strictly from a cost-benefit ratio. I mean, before we can do any kind of relocation, any kind of mitigation, we have to look at the cost-benefit aspect and make sure that it's cost-effective for the taxpayer. That doesn't take into some of the social aspects that some of my my co-panelists talked about, especially in places like Louisiana, where there's a long generational history in those areas. That makes it a lot more difficult.
I think from the residents' perspective, talking from our personal experience with the buyouts on Staten Island, that although it was very bittersweet, it was really the only way that these residents could recover. It was just too much of a catastrophic event. And so, as a matter of fact, just last week, it's weird how these things work, I just ran into a couple who just went on and on for about 45 minutes just saying how happy they are that they were bought out. And so I asked them a question. I said, what would you do if I came to you a month before Sandy and I said to you, you know what, I'm talking to the governor's people and there's a way to get your value now plus 15% because there was a bonus, there was an incentive that was very important and to help people to make that decision. I said, what would you do? And they said, absolutely no way would we have left. And our neighbors on either side wouldn't leave, across the street wouldn't leave. Because they really needed that event to make it, completely understood that they didn't belong there. And it's not that it was easy to live there, because it was very unique, I think, our situation. First of all, as I explained, we were in this marsh, and it was a blue belt that was designated by DEC and DEP back in the 60s and 70s to allow stormwater, rather than build storm sewers, allow stormwater into this area. And so as a result, whenever there was just a big rainfall, everyone's house would flood, the streets would flood. In addition to that, because of those Phragmites are an invasive plant that was very dry, and amazingly, Staten Island, New York, part of this New York City, was #1 for brush fires. And you have all upstate to contend with, we were #1 because there was also a threat of brush fires. So despite all that, they loved the community, they wanted to live there, but they needed a big event to leave. And I personally think it was very successful. I haven't met any resident who said, I wish it didn't get bought out. Not one. And I've met at least 100 of them over the last 2 years. But what's interesting, and I'll leave it with this, is that New York City at the same time is still issuing building permits the street right across where the buyout occurred, in the same exact area, and there's I'm a real estate broker, there is an insatiable demand for housing, period, and in this area, the stigma of the storm is already gone. So at the same time, they're also doing this Build It Back program where the residents who did want out, who missed the state program, sold their property to the city, and then that was redeveloped by selling to investors who had to conform to the new code. So I think from New York City's perspective, I'm not sure what they think. I think from the governor's perspective, he realized what he did was a great thing because it did help the residents who live inside that floodplain, the inland portion. They made them a little bit safer. That's my perspective.
You know, if this were easy, we wouldn't need to have this panel. So the fact that we're all sitting up here struggling and some of us coming to different conclusions, partly because of the different geography in which we work, and others because of just different perspectives we have professionally. But clearly, the most cost-effective measure for risk reduction is quit building in the floodplain. But since that's not going to happen, and as I tried to illustrate in my slide, about 35 to 40% of the city of Norfolk will be in the floodplain in the future. That's not necessarily a practical way to approach it either. So what we did was we took the approach to quit focusing on the negative, quit worrying about where the water is going to be, and in fact focus on the positive. That is where the water isn't going to be. So instead of focusing on problems, we started looking at opportunities. And to tag along with some of what my fellow panelists have said, we took a whole of community, whole of government. We have taken a whole of community, whole of government approach to this because without getting buy-in, you can make the best plans in the world, but unless the people buy into them, they'll never come to fruition. And the other thing that I would mention from the perspective of cost effectiveness is to ensure that whatever you do, it has co-benefits, so that what you do is benefiting the citizens to the greatest extent possible for the expense that is being incurred.
Yeah, I think the general idea of risk avoidance is where the majority of our investments should be in the future. I think the Staten Island example, I think the Valmeyer Illinois example, those are amazing projects, but they're ultimately one-offs in the aftermath of significant disaster events. That's not to say that we shouldn't pursue those types of projects when disaster events happen in the future. But the reality is, if we're going to take a longer-term, larger-scale approach to the problem, it has to be with the idea of, as my friend from Norfolk just said, focusing on the positive, right? And how do we incentivize smarter development in the areas that we do think are going to be naturally better protected, while also, at the very least, I think, educating folks that are living in those floodplains now and in the future as to the risks they face, while also building out a policy apparatus that can at least de-incentivize further development in those areas that are going to be at a greater degree of risk.
Well, I can't say which is better. I just can speak from a community perspective, and once again from the presentation is that if you have those relationships, then I would be more willing to trust the researcher or whoever coming to the community to advise the community. One of the things I want to point out is through this process, with the LSA program and meeting and working with Matt, I never told Matt this, and I don't know if you remember, but I first met Matt at a Oxfam event at Loyola, and we was at the table and there was a discussion, and we was on the opposite side of that discussion, and I left and I was like, man, that guy is a butthole, But then I seen Matt come into my community, and I seen Matt do his presentations, and I got to know Matt on some sidebars and have some personal conversations with him, and building that relationship with Matt. Now I understand what Matt is talking about, that it might be necessary for these communities to relocate coming from a community perspective, you never want to leave. You never want to have that culture separation. And especially organizing in Lower Terrebonne Parish, there's a Native American population, and one of their heritages is that they must have land, and they're fighting to be federally recognized. So that adds to the complexity of it when you talk about the isle being relocated. So there's a lot of people that talk about culture, talk about family, talk about heritage. But then you have individuals like Matt said, well, then if you look at the science and you look at the data, you might want to consider relocating. Now, up front, I didn't want to hear that, but building relationships with individuals like Matt and knowing where his heart is and seeing the science and have someone explain the science to you, then I think the community is more receptive when they are involved in processes such as LA Safe.
Grab the open mic here. I guess I wanted to pose a, egocentric question, since we're in Louisiana and I live in Louisiana and we've got a couple of people from Louisiana here. I'd like to hear from our panelists who are from out of state. Having seen Matt's presentation and having listened to Donald talk about the communities where he's representing, where he's working, from your experiences in Illinois and New York and Virginia, or Nicholas, all the places you've been, what advice do you have for Matt, for Donald, for the communities where they're working and where they're, not just for them in their jobs, but for the people that they work with? What sort of advice do you have about what kind of one or two takeaways should filter down to Golden Meadow or to some various other communities that are looking at these issues?
So we've done a lot of buyouts, and I'm virtually certain that whether it's a Jimmy Buffett wannabe in Florida or a Cajun in Louisiana or a river rat along the Mississippi River on the Upper Miss, property rights are a big deal, and the people that live on that water live there for a reason, because they love living on that water. It's virtually impossible to get a full-scale buyout, to get a full-scale relocation done. But you can chip away at it. You can do it piecemeal. And usually successive floods, the light bulb goes off in their heads. And, you might do one or two buyouts in a community one year. A flood happens the next year, and you'll have 20 people knocking at your door wanting you to buy them out immediately. The other important thing is, I always say this, is get it while that carp is still flopping on their couch. Because there is something called flood amnesia, and people forget about it literally months after the flood. There'll still be a mud line on the wall, and they'll swear that they never had water in their house ever. So expeditious buyouts are important, and just keep chipping away at them are important, from my perspective.
Sorry. Well, if you look at my recipe, but in the recipe, I talked about having a committee, and I think it's important to have that. I'll tell you from my experience with that, I had other communities come to me and ask to be helped because they wanted to get bought out, and they had decided they wanted to do that. But I'll talk about now for the communities that did want to get bought out but weren't bought out. And the reason was because that community was fractured. They would have a community meeting. For instance, there was an area called Midland Beach, another one South Beach. And there was probably a quarter of each of those areas that were completely devastated. So if those residents were identified who wanted to get bought out, and they would be able to isolate themselves and maybe come to us that we could present to the governor, they probably, I would say most definitely would have been included. So the idea is to find these communities that want that, and it may not be an entire community, it may just be a block or two, excuse me. And I think it's hard to deal with the community as a whole. So if it's 20 or 30 people, to get them all in a room and have you discuss it, to have a couple of leaders, maybe there's 2 or 3 leaders that you can communicate with on a regular basis, and then once in a while have a community meeting. I think if you break it down, that you can do it. But if you don't do that, people or blocks will get lost.
Joe, while you've got the mic, I wanted to ask you a follow-up. A lot of the efforts we're trying to pull off here in Louisiana and what's happened in Illinois involve the community staying together and moving together. Is that what happened
No, it's interesting, and for some reason I haven't been able to get the state to give any information in terms of where the people moved, so I only know it from experience when people let me know where they left. And I think that's also an anomaly here that we experience, because I think a lot of people, when you think especially of managed retreat, it's taking a community and moving them all
And if
in the same spot.
if keeping the community together had been a goal, or had been a deal breaker, really, would it have even been possible to do what you did?
No, not with the infrastructure Staten Island has. There's no additional land. It's not like we're upstate New York near a river and you can just find some other parcel that's, reasonably priced. This was the lower priced properties on Staten Island, despite the fact that they were right near the water. But it had started from the beginning of the 1900s as just bungalows that were there just for summer cottages, really, and then they were expanded to, like my place, probably in 1940 or so. They added a back, which included a bathroom and a furnace. Other than that, it was a cold water flat. So, so it was, economically feasible for that community to go.
Being turned off might be better. Far be it from me to offer the good folks of Louisiana any suggestions. We have looked at Louisiana actually as a model in many ways of resilience in the ability and the willingness to live with water for 300-400 years. There's lots of pictures of folks who live in houses that are out in the bayou, and they don't own a car, they own a boat, and that's how they that's their form of transportation. I would argue that living with water is for our coastal communities is our future, and it's what we should be thinking of going forward. I'm also going to pose a question back to you, and that's why is it that the prevailing opinion seems to be that the public sector has a responsibility to indemnify people from the risks that they have voluntarily chosen to take? Now, I absolutely understand that there are communities, Native American communities, there are communities that have little in the way of means, and that we have shunted them as a society into places where, quite frankly, we shouldn't be living. And I think that there is some sort of a social resilience question there that we need to talk about. But the problem is that when we start indemnifying folks from the risk that they're taking, that brush sweeps pretty broadly, and it includes an awful lot of folks who have voluntarily accepted that risk with the full expectation that if things go badly, the federal and state and local governments are going to be there to bail them out. And I think that is a fundamental conversation that we need to have as to whether or not that is morally, ethically, and economically the correct position we should be taking.
Yeah, I'd like to take that, actually. So I think I morally agree with your point. I think from a practical perspective, so, the Office of Community Development that I work for, we have a CDBG portfolio in excess of $16 billion from Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, and then 1,000-year flood events in March and August of last year. I think through that type of expenditure, I think through the asset risk liability associated with the National Flood Insurance Program, I think given the state of I would say the generally low quality of many of the flood insurance rate maps that we have. I mean, in the state of Louisiana, we have flood insurance rate maps, and in some cases are supported by LIDAR data that was shot in the 80s. So we haven't really, as a country, taken seriously our understanding of our watersheds and our floodplains in a way that I think we can even responsibly put the the onus back on the public to make good development decisions. And so, the upshot is we have these catastrophic disaster events, and there's always going to be political pressure to show up with massive sums of the public's money to rebuild after those events. And as long as that's the system that's in place, I think essentially the American taxpayer has decided, and we have decided as a society, that we're going to fill that role. Whether that's the right role for the American taxpayer to fill, I don't know that I would disagree with you, but I think the system that we currently have certainly supports that notion.
I think that's right. I think for the last 30 to 40 years, the only real thing that's sacrosanct politically anymore is property rights. And so therefore that becomes the only thing that gets protected. And that is part of a larger conversation that needs to happen. I think we'd like to open questions up to the room. There's a microphone up here if anybody's, and don't do that, if anybody's interested in asking some questions of our panel. Yes, please.
Yeah, for there is a comment that the city of New York is giving building permits to rebuild on the same location. Is that to people who have such a large disposable income that if they lose that house to a storm, it doesn't affect their life?
You might think that it would make sense, but not at all. They're building, basically similar price structures, but they're building it according to the new FEMA guidelines. And what's, somewhat insane to me is that a lot of the residents in the Fox Beach area had gone through that in 1992 when they had their nor'easter bring in 5 feet, 7 feet of flood surge, and their houses were destroyed in that, and they rebuilt to the new FEMA level, and those houses were subsequently destroyed in Sandy.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm Dave Jackson, an academic seismologist from California. First, a comment. I think the discussion here has really been helpful to me because my wife and I look across the country and say, why in the hell do people continue to live there? And I think this really broadens the issues, and I think a lot of people need to hear this kind of conversation to understand what the issues are. My question is about risk-benefit analysis. It's a term I think that's a favorite with planners who have to make decisions. And I think private people also have a kind of risk-benefit analysis of a much different scale because they have to make decisions too, and they know that there's a cost to making a move and there's a benefit to avoiding some kind of risk. How do you translate the kind of decisions that are made in a planning scale to the kind of decisions you hope people will make in private? Can they understand, particularly the long term? I think I've heard a couple times mentioned resilience on a 100-year time scale or 50-year time scale. Can people be convinced that that's important to them, that they should pay something for that kind of resilience? How do you convince them if you want them to be convinced?
Anybody got experience with that?
Yeah, I actually think that looking out over a longer period of time, at least in my experience, has helped us introduce ideas and concepts that would be far too controversial to talk about as a present-day action. And so as a mechanism to begin having harder conversations, it's easier to talk about it in a 50-year or 100-year timeline than, hey, we need to do this in the next 2 years. And so I think just to begin having the right series of discussions, thinking along a time continuum makes sense. In the state of Louisiana, we also have just a robust data set that helps us understand what landform and flood risk will reasonably look like over the next 50 years. And so being able to show, for example, when we talk about what Louisiana looked like in 1960 and go to present day and then show along, a 50-year timeline, a progression, it's very difficult to argue, at least here, that changes are not taking place, right? You can't argue with satellite imagery, as hard as some people would try. So, I mean, I think in our case, it's been beneficial to talk about it along that timeline. I think, you know, one of the things that is terrifying to all of us that live in Louisiana, you know, we're talking about some more controversial and broader concepts today, but, you know, if we're not able to effectuate any degree of change before the next Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane takes aim at our coast, you know, we still could reasonably incur catastrophic damages.
I think also it's important to talk about there are actually disclosure issues, and I'll tell you a quick story about our own group. Is when we first met in the community meetings, and then you'll see actually if you go on my website, you'll see the testimonials, how many people said they had no idea they were in a flood zone. So after seeing my map, should say, how is that possible? Well, when they're looking for a home, they're not looking at a Google Earth map. They're driving through the streets, and they see something that's serene and beautiful. And then at the closing, so many people said, why am I paying an extra $50 a month for what is flood insurance? What does Zone A mean? What does that mean? So that became a real issue, and it's being recognized all over the place. As a matter of fact, I just heard that NRDC, I think, is introducing or trying to get legislation introduced as they extend the National Flood Insurance Program to get legislation in there that will increase the disclosure requirements. The Wall Street Journal is going to do an article this week or next week about the fact that many residents in New York, not just Staten Island, Long Island, wherever, had no idea that they were in a floodplain. So I think when you raise that disclosure and you raise that awareness, then people will have, you know, to think twice when they make that decision if they're going to buy in these areas.
Is it a quick one?
Yes.
Okay.
Really quick, yeah.
Go for it.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Paris. I live here in New Orleans, and I've been here for 3 years now. I'm from DC. And I'm almost 27 years old, looking to maybe buy a house someday, invest in a place, and I'm torn about living here in New Orleans. And I'm wondering what your advice would be for a young person such as myself. Should I choose to stay here, or should I choose to live in a more logical place? Thank you.
So there are reporters in the room, so I won't answer your question directly. What I will tell you is that the city of New Orleans is protected by a risk reduction system that the Corps of Engineers is only going to maintain up to the year 2022. After that, it will sink. And as of now, at least to my knowledge, we don't have a mechanism to cover the ongoing operations and maintenance costs of that system. And so if you play out the string on that logic, eventually, you know, if we don't maintain that system, that will substantially change our flood profile here in the city, would significantly impact the floodplain itself and the rates that you would pay for flood insurance and ostensibly property values.
As a homeowner in New Orleans, I'll say, yeah, it's okay. Buy in the city, keep within the storm reduction system, don't buy slab on grade, make sure it's elevated, and you'll be okay for a few decades.
So I literally get this same call 10 times a day on my phone at work. Not about New Orleans, but about other places in Illinois. And I can tell you as a first-time home buyer, look at the National Flood Hazard Layer and do not buy a house in the floodplain, because as a home buyer, when you take out a mortgage, you'll have to buy flood insurance. And the National Flood Insurance Program is $26 billion in debt, and premiums are going up every single year. So you will soon find your mortgage increased exponentially if you buy a house in the floodplain. So not by your choice.
And let me add that I've never met a molecule of floodwater that can read a map. So just because it's just outside the floodplain doesn't mean that it isn't going to flood. So buy flood insurance.
But it does mean you don't have to buy flood insurance if you're just outside that line. So.
Buy flood insurance.
Buy flood insurance.
Yeah, even if you don't have to, go ahead and buy it.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much for coming to this early session and providing some warmth to this gigantic room. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Nicholas for organizing this. And have a great day. Enjoy your visit to New Orleans. If you need any restaurant recommendations, I'm happy to make them. Thanks.